Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and after roughly 10,000 requests, it's finally time to make a spooky cat. But not just one spooky cat, 3 spooky cats. Well, okay, 2 spooky cats and 1 stuffed animal. Speaking of which, let's start there. Like any stuffed bunny turned murderous monster, I'll start with a ball of clay that I can roll into a roughly teardrop-shaped shape that I can then poke some shoulder holes into. A couple little strips layered on top of one another will be the zipper, and a quick bit of scalpel-related texturing will make it look a bit more zippery. The legs are just slightly tapered sausages with some stitching stitched into the sides and around the feet, which can then be stuck to the underside of the body. The arms then are the exact same thing, except they're slightly skinnier and get stuck into the shoulder holes. Then an even longer, skinnier tail can get attached to the backside, and that's the body finished. To make the head, I'll start with another ball of clay that I can poke and prod until I've got an oversized, toothless, smiley mouth that I'll then draw a line along the back of the head to create the center seam. Then a couple button-sized circles for eyes and a little nose for a nose, followed by another little circle in the center of the mouth to make that speaker thing, and that's the majority of the facial details done as well. I can then attach the head to the body and add a couple kitty ears to the top of the head, and in barely more than a minute of edited video, I've got a heckin' adorable little feline stuffy ready to be turned into a gangly purple monstrosity. As is very much the theme in most of my videos, I'll start with a ball of clay that I can then roll into an appropriately shaped sausage. Then I'll add a couple questionably positioned balls to my sausage and blend them in quickly to avoid demonetization before poking some divots around the body where the various limbs will attach later. Otherwise, with my body map mapped out, I can start to add the gnarly details on and around the limb indents, thickening up the shoulder blades and hip bones before beginning the enribboning process. Apart from his creepy red fog-emitting mouth, I think Catnap's emaciated ribs are one of his most prominent features, so I'll really take the time and make sure they look exceptionally unsettling. Of course, each rib ends in an over-exaggerated spinal protrusion, so I'll poke some dots down his spine on top of each of the ribs before filling them in with some little balls and blending it all together. Finally, before I bake the body, I'll add the belly zipper and texture it appropriately. But with that, the body can be baked and I can drill some holes to fit the arms and legs. I want the limbs to be removable to make future furring easier, so instead of gluing the armature in place, I'll fill each of the sockets with a little ball of clay that I can then press the armature wire bones into. Then once I've got the position of the knees and elbows figured out, I'll bake the body once more to lock the little balls in place before popping them out of the sockets and giving each limb a thick layer of clay. I'm not worried too much about the detail on the limbs since I'm going to be furring them later and a lot of the finer detail would get covered up anyway. But after making a little tail, that's the body finished, so it's time to make the face. Once again, I'll start with a little ball, but this time I'll get the initial shape by pressing it onto my desk to flatten the front so I have a nice smooth surface to build the big goofy smile on top of. Now, through the magic of editing, it looks like I know what I'm doing as I make a pretty good one-to-one representation of Catnap's face, but for the disenfranchised out there, rest assured knowing that this is my 4th or 5th attempt and I'm about 3 hours into making this stupid, oddly shaped head. Catnap's face is kinda front and center, so if it looks wrong, then the whole thing is gonna look wrong. However, given how little detail there is, it's easy to make it look not quite right. Also, because his mouth is so big and so empty, there isn't enough room to add any sort of armature frame, so as I was pushing and pulling and sculpting the shape, I was constantly messing up the angle of things. Eventually, though, I ended up with a pretty perfect looking rendition. However, because it was about 50% too big, I had to smush that and start over, which is what you see here. A Catnap face that isn't just good, it's good enough. I'll make the creepy little eyes by pressing some kebab skewers into the center of his eye sockets, and I'll attach the stump of a neck to the back of his head for mounting later before adding some lumpy cones to the top of his head and reshaping them into ear-shaped shapes. A final bit of scarring and damage to the right ear, and that's 5 or 6 or so hours of work boiled down into a 50-second clip. Last but not least, I'll make his little feetsies by taking another little ball of clay and smooshing the tip flat so as I can cut some little toes into the front and reshape them into cat-appropriate beans before poking some little divots into the front so I can fit some pre-baked toe talons into the tips. A little texturing and I can repeat this process 3 more times to give me the full set, then some divots to make attaching them later easier, and it's time to assemble this creepy naked cat. With that though, this cat is done, which means we are on to our last and final form. And again, we're starting with a ball of clay. In fact, the building of this body is pretty much identical to Catnap Phase 2's building the body, except the belly is a little less belly-y and the ribs are a bit more ribby. Mostly this version of Catnap is a spooky, not quite skeleton version of the fluffy Phase 2 Catnap. I say not quite skeleton since there's still a very thin layer of skin draped over the ribs and torso, presumably because having his guts hanging out would be maybe a bit too unsettling. Also, it's probably a lot easier to 3D model a body than a skeleton. It's definitely easier to sculpt a body than a skeleton, so personally, I certainly appreciate the artistic choice here. Once my slightly more skeletal version of the body is baked, I can attach the limb bones, but this time I'll attach them directly and glue them in place since I don't need to be able to take this guy apart at any point. Then, once I've angled the legs into a slightly creepier low-profile pose, I can add some little lumps to the sockets to create the insertion points of the bones, as well as add little lumps to the knees and elbows, so I can make the single strip of armature wire look like a couple bones connecting at the tips. I'll then add a little lump to the bottom of each leg before building up his bony tail. I can add some vertebrae attaching it to the rest of the body, but otherwise it's just a long sausagey noodle. I also don't want to make the armature wire bones any thicker than they already are, but I do want to add at least a tiny bit of texture, so instead of trying to cover them in a thin layer of clay, I'm just going to coat each of the legs in a thin layer of liquid Sculpey. Then once that's all been baked, I can set the body aside and get to work making another oddly shaped head. This time though, I've got a bit of a better idea as to how to make it, as well as a general disinterest in making it a dozen times, so this time I made it in a single take. I started by flattening the bottom first and sculpting my eye sockets and upper lip and bony details before adding a great big spooky hanging mouth to the underside and blending it all together. A couple little ears can get added to the top, and once they've been hollowed out and shaped appropriately, I'll add it to the bony body and bake it all so it's stuck together. The last thing to make then will be his bony feet. Another little ball can be rolled into a teeny tiny sausage with a sharpened point, then using a sharp silicone shaper I'll add the bony segments before using a round handled tool to slightly curve each phalange. I'll then slightly curve the talon tip, and that's one finger finished and ready to be added to the other 11. To connect all the fingers to the leg, I'll take one final ball and add some indents to turn it into a kinda bony looking palm that I can then stick a set of 4 fingers into. This then becomes my foot or hand or whatever it is at this point, and I can repeat this process to give me all 4 fingered feet. Then once Catnap Phase 3's been glued onto the feet, I can stick some more little kebab skewers into his eye sockets, and that's my final form finished, which means all 3 phases are sculpted and ready for a coat of paint. I'll start this little adventure by disassembling the stuffy version so I can get paint into all the little nooks and crannies. Each of the body parts will get a coating of light purple, and the airbrush makes quick work of these base coats and turns what would have been an hour or more of multi-coat work into roughly 10 minutes of spraying. For the spooky skeleton version though, I'll give the whole body a base coat of dirty dark brown. I'll then paint the inside of the mouth with the flattest black I have before getting to work spookifying up his body. I know the hallucination version of Catnap is a mostly gray affair, but given all the red lighting and spooky effects happening whenever you see it, there's often a slightly reddish pinkish hue to him, and I wanted to recreate that, so I'll sponge several layers of reddish brownish bone color onto the body. The sponge creates some interesting texture and ensures that the paint stays out of the recesses, retaining the darker brown shading between the ribs and around all the bony bits. Finally, I'll paint the tip of the kebab skewer white, then using a teeny tiny ball stylus, I'll add a teeny tiny black dot to the center of each. With that, this spooky bone boy is done, and I can get back to painting the purple duo. I'll paint the plush's eyes black, then do the same things for its nose, mouth, and zipper before painting the experimental version zipper black and giving it a light gray dry brushing to bring the detail out before doing the exact same thing to its toenails with a gray dry brush on the tips. I'll then give the inside of the mouth a couple coats of the blackest black I own before painting the kebabs the same white with the little black dots that the hallucination version has. And with that, my double purple duo's painting is done. However, they're not quite finished yet. You see, I have this bag of ultrafine 1mm long purple static grass that I think would be perfect for making these guys nice and fluffy. And to apply it, I'm going to use this fancy little electric box. This magical little box statically charges the fur grass, launching it into the air and sticking it to whatever happens to be floating above. Of course, there's a lot of stuff currently floating above the box off camera that I'd rather not coat in a fine layer of purple dust, so to somewhat contain this fluffy horror, I'll use my multi-purpose plastic box. Then using a little sieve to help break up the clumps, I can add a bunch of the fur to the top of the box, and given how my camera immediately starts freaking out, you can really see just how obnoxious this purple fur is. Finally, to affix the fur to the model, I'll paint each of the parts in a thick layer of thin PVA glue. Then it's as simple as turning the box on and witnessing magic firsthand. Well, secondhand, I guess, because this is recorded, but I witnessed it firsthand, and it was magical. I'll then repeat this for each of the body parts until they're completely coated in a layer of purple fur, at which point I'll set them aside so the glue can dry. Once the glue's dried, I can begin assembling my parts into a couple of bodies. With that, I finally got some extra furry cats, but the coloring ain't quite right, so it's back to the airbrush. The plush version needs to be a little bit lighter and a little bit more washed out, so I'll start by painting the inside of the ears and the tips of the hands and feet with a darker purple before blasting the body with a couple coats of less vibrant purple, followed by a much lighter, much less saturated top coat. I'll then come back in with some black to clean up all the overspray, as well as give the eyes a nice glossy varnish. And the experimental version is also a bit too bright, so I'll give his fur coat a full once over with some darker purples to bring that brightness down a few pegs. Finally, to make the stitches that keep his limbs from falling off, I'll string some thin black thread between my helping hands and give them a CA glue coating which, when cured, leaves the thread stiff and easy to cut. These little cut pieces can then be glued between the limbs and the body to create the aforementioned stitches. With that, each of my little beasties are built, so the absolute final piece to finish each of them off will be adding their little crescent moon zipper pulls. I made each of these off camera while waiting for glue to dry, but I forgot that the hallucination version is supposed to be silver, so once it's in place I'll paint it the appropriate color. Otherwise, that's us done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk on Patreon who keep this channel running, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them: Galila Miller, Nilwick Man Guy, Philip Bright, Knights Code 09, Daryl Tries Making, Aaron M. Wysong, Kevin McFadden, Matt Cornell, Little Cub 3, Hayden Hansen, Lucas Green, Grey Crow, Astro Web, Scorpo J, Hannah, Shauna Curtis, Sarah Jane, and Frankie's dad. And to be clear, that's the Frankie with the elephant named Ellie. You are the extra fine purple fur that coats the inside of my lungs. I realize now that Poppy's playtime is pretty much on brand for what I make, so if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, then let me know in the comments below and maybe I'll make something while it's still fresh and relevant. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.